In this video, I'm going to give 9 bold predictions for MMA in 2025 and format it as a bingo card. I've been hearing the phrase, well, that wasn't in my bingo card for 2024, so I thought, why not actually just make a bingo card of predictions to keep track of? So here they are, and to me in the future, I am so proud of you for remembering to look back at this. So without further ado, here is my 2025 MMA bingo card. After losing his UFC debut, Carlos Ulberg has looked incredible, and if he can get past Jan Blachowicz, he is primed for his next fight to be for a UFC title, whether that be for the undisputed title or an interim belt. Carlos has everything you'd want from a UFC champion, and this is exemplified by the advantage of coming from the Australia/New Zealand region. With many of the current stars from the region on the tail end of their career, the UFC would love to have someone to chuck on at the top of these Australia/New Zealand cards. So I'm sure they are going to push him into a title shot if he can get past Jan. Let's all just put away our personal opinions on Muhammad Mokaev. If the UFC want to be known as the pinnacle of the sport, they can't be cutting a 23-year-old undefeated fighter who might just be the hottest prospect in the division, just because he is boring and quite unlikable. There is obviously a lot more going on under the surface behind the story that we just don't know about, but with the UFC's golden boy literally involved in a hit and run with a pregnant lady, outside of something actually criminal, rational minds suggest that there is no non-petty reason Muhammad Mokaev should not be in the UFC. With the PFL struggling to meet contractual obligations and Mokaev being managed by Tim Simpson, who by all accounts has excellent relations with the UFC, I do see a pathway for Mokaev back into the UFC by the end of 2025. There are a few current UFC champions who you'd feel are going to challenge for a second title in 2025. Islam and Ilya are front of mind. It'd be tough to schedule around both of them wanting to move up, but whether it's Islam, Ilya, both, or even someone like Pantoja, I'm going to predict that any UFC champion who gets a shot at a second title fails. My thinking here in the second era of UFC 2-weight champions is that MMA has progressed and the skill gap between fighters has become more and more nuanced. Size differences and physical advantages therefore are going to become more definitive to the results of a fight compared to just a few years ago. Presuming we're not going to get an influx of new weight classes, I think the ratio of success for 2-weight title challenges are going to trend downwards as the UFC progresses, eventually coming full circle to the point where a UFC champion holding 2 belts will again feel like an unobtainable achievement. So why not start the trend in 2025? I think Valentina potentially moving up and challenging for the Bantamweight Championship is the biggest threat to this prediction, but looking at how the schedule is working out and the parties involved, I actually think it's more likely to take place in 2026, if ever. One Championship's MMA divisions are actually cooked at the moment, and I think throughout 2025 we will have less than 7 title fights in the whole calendar year. For context, 2024 only had 8 title fights, with 2 of them being for interim titles. So I predict we will continue to see a downward trend of one championship not being able to put on MMA title fights. To be fair, one do actually have 3 MMA title fights scheduled currently, which takes us all the way to the end of March. But with those fights consisting of a good chunk of their most active champions, and Anatoly and Christian Lee holding 4 belts between them, I genuinely don't see them getting to 7 by the end of 2025. Seika Ozawa and Stamp Fairtex are easily the biggest female stars in MMA not in the UFC, and much like they did with Cyborg, I see the UFC wanting to build a division around either one of them, but particularly Seika, who they have a much better chance of signing. Look, the UFC's female featherweight division didn't exactly work as planned, but the pool of talent in the female atomweight division compared to the female featherweight is massive. And simply, there are just much more females in the world who could compete at atomweight compared to featherweight. Not to mention there are already multiple organizations running successful atomweight divisions, to the point where you could easily poach and quickly populate a top 15. From the UFC's perspective, the structure of their broadcast deals have incentivized holding more events with more fights on each of them more often. They simply just need more fighters. We see with their huge investment in the male flyweights that the UFC is looking for an untapped market to fill their cards, and I think the female atomweights can do a great job at adding to their roster for relatively cheap. Joe Rogan is the easiest lock for the UFC Hall of Fame. It's just a matter of when. Personally, I think it would be best to do this while Joe is still working, rather than waiting for him to take a step back from the commentary gig. Unveiling it at UFC 312, even though taking place in Sydney, Australia, therefore making it unlikely for Joe to attend, which would kill this theory, but it will mark 300 numbered events since Joe started working for the organization at UFC 12. And that could be quite sentimental. I'm a bit doubtful of this prediction and think in 2 years, in and around Joe's 30th anniversary with the organization, will be more likely if they're not waiting for his retirement. So I'm throwing in another bold Hall of Fame shout with Mirko Cro Cop. Even though Cro Cop's UFC run was a huge disappointment, there is next to no one more deserving of being in the pioneer wing than Cro Cop. When I see Kazushi Sakuraba deservedly in the UFC Hall of Fame, who only fought in the UFC twice, it makes me believe that Cro Cop can get in on solely his achievements in Pride and outside of the UFC as well. In 2024, out of all the major organizations, the UFC had the lowest finish rate with 45%. I actually think this shines a positive light on the UFC, as it highlights the level of talent and that their matchmaking is consistently putting on competitively even fights. But it can't be denied that there is a factor of enjoyment loss when more than half of your fights are going to decisions. And when you are holding so many fights per card, it can definitely make things drag. In 2023, the finish rate was 52%, with a 7% decrease in 2024 to 45%. There are a lot of reasons behind this. The new glove experiment in isolation had a lower finish rate compared to the old gloves. You also had more fights in the female and lower male weight divisions, which have a significantly lower finish rate on average. But I think the largest factor to this trend is that simply we are starting to reach a plateau point in MMA skill level at the highest level, where there just isn't as many fighters who are exponentially better than the rest of the roster. Every fighter's striking and grappling defense has to be at a super high level to even get ranked in the UFC, not to mention the overall improvements in cardio and physical conditioning, meaning fighters just aren't gassing out in round 3 all the time anymore. All this means I predict we will see a continued drop in finish rate percentage in 2025 down to below 42%. It's probably a bold enough prediction just to say Jones versus Aspinall actually happens in 2025, but I'm going to go a step further and predict how the whole situation plays out. So Jones is going to ask for a boatload of money, and to pay that bill, the UFC accepts another naming sponsorship from Saudi Arabia, again to host another Rider Season branded event like UFC 306, or to host a fight in Saudi Arabia itself. However, Jon Jones will pull out in the lead up to this fight, and Alex Pereira will challenge Tom Aspinall for the undisputed heavyweight championship on short notice and ultimately lose. So I don't think this is actually a bold prediction and is almost certainly happening in the background, but I want to talk about it anyways. But I'm predicting a state-backed entity from the Middle East makes a major move into MMA above simple sponsorship. The most clear pathway for this is Saudi-backed SRJ Sport Investments, who own a minority stake in the PFL. I predict they will further increase their position into a majority or near majority stake and start making moves into truly turning the organization into a genuine competitor to the UFC. I see a similar story that happened with Live Golf or the Saudi Pro League in football a few years ago, just replicated in MMA, where essentially a state-sponsored league starts attracting the biggest names in the sport purely through financial brute force. There is a lot of stuff coming out regarding the antitrust suit and the UFC contracts in general, and that's a topic for another video. But in general, we are talking about the unfair locking in of a fighter to their contract and beyond. No matter how this all plays out, whether that be through legal consequence or inside risk aversion, it's hard to see a world where fighters don't have more freedoms when negotiating contracts in the very near future. I also predict that part of this change will involve a major rebrand of the PFL. The PFL itself has next to no brand equity, and it actually may be advantageous to move away from the brand in favor of starting fresh. The PFL also, as an American-based organization, comes with pesky legislation that make a financial takeover of an entire sport quite difficult. So I also predict the PFL changing its headquarters to outside of the US. So those were 9 predictions I have for MMA in 2025. I'm fairly confident I can get 3 in a row somewhere on this card by the end of the year. Let me know in the comments below what your predictions are for the year, and as always, thank you all for your continued support, it means the world, and I'll see you in the next video.